This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week's guest is David O'Carroll. David runs an 11-acre agroforestry learning centre in Totnes, Devon, where he teaches natural farming methods based on the techniques around Indigenous Microorganisms and Korean natural farming. He focuses on building healthy soil to produce healthy plants and is both generous with his time and knowledge, as he aims to share the details of his techniques to help other growers. David begins by telling me about his background and how he began his micro farm.
My background is farming purely just in a hobby sense, an interest. So where I was living a number of years ago whilst doing my full-time job, which was in IT and in training, I used to grow indoors simply because I had a lack of space. So a lot of my garden was taken up with multiple levels. So living walls, living roofs, hydroponics, aquaponics, everything that I could squeeze into a small scale and small space, rooted on where I was actually living at the time, which was a town and a city centre base rather than where I am now, which is in the middle of nowhere down in South Devon. So my interest was initially purely on a hobby basis. And then when circumstances meant that I could leave my full-time job and take up an opportunity full-time on the land, that's when I expanded my learning and went on a learning journey, if you like, taking in permaculture, taking in different methods, but on a larger scale so that I could accommodate the space that I have and how I would want to take that land and regenerate that land, but do it also on a budget, because that's always what's driving new farmers, is the budget as such. So for me, finding Korean natural farming was through the route of the Jeff Lowenthals route, if you like. So yeah, the introduction into microbes and understanding that it's life, the soil that primarily is the health of the plant. And that's essentially where I got to and found KNF quite a few years ago now, back in 2008. So I've been using this methodology alongside others, but on a larger scale, simply because of the situation that I am lucky enough to find myself in.
I've actually interviewed Jeff on the podcast, and I mentioned just before we started recording another author who is based in the States who's written a kind of book on these themes. Why does it seem to be gaining ground in the States, and why did it originate in Korea, and why are we not doing it here?
Well, natural farming as such is nature. So it's done worldwide. It's just how is that adapted to the regional area? So you'll come across an Indian natural farming, which is rooted in the fact that the main animals are goats in that system. And the reason why Korean natural farming has developed specifically from that region is because of the livestock that is involved in that culture. So there it's chicken and pig based rather than being goat based. So the reason why Korean natural farming was developed, or how it was developed by Master Cho, Hunkuk Cho, back in the 1960s, was that Korea has a unique topography, unique geography, where it is quite mountainous. But also because of the nature and the size of the landmass that they have, the concentration of populations mean a lot of the farming is done intensively and indoors as such. So pigs and chickens as an example, the waste streams from those are hard to control in an industrial environment, such as what you have in the United States, but obviously on a much larger scale. The reason why Master Cho developed his system as such, with the Korean natural farming system, is based around the idea of a no-smell piggery. So to be able to combat the odours associated with growing pigs close to the home or close to industrial or residential areas. An example of where that came to a more global recognition is when during the Beijing Olympics, 2008 Olympics, The system was utilized by the Chinese army because they grow what they eat as they travel. So to be able to be barracked in areas close to residential areas, they had to have a way of controlling the smell of the pigs and of the waste streams as such. So where Korean natural farming was developed primarily for the enhancement of livestock in that environment, it's also been used to combat the problems associated with livestock rearing close to residential areas. So the system meant that there's no smell piggery, which is based on the fact that a pig will clear up its own mess and will be able to feed the environment, which essentially feeds itself. That's what's created within Korean natural farming, is an environment which mimics that which a pig would naturally find themselves in, woodland specifically. So the best place to be rearing pigs would be within a woodland environment, because they do both the work of fertilizing and clearing and regeneration at the same time as not walking on concrete floors. The Korean natural farming system essentially allows a pig to be a true pig in an environment that mimics what they should be in naturally, so therefore gives them a much more comfortable way of life, and therefore they're reared in a much more healthy way as well. That's essentially what Korean natural farming is derived from the idea that you can have a more balanced and a healthy ecosystem for raising livestock by mimicking the environment that they would be living in naturally. And that's where the forests are so important within the raising of pigs, but also we try to recreate that environment for pigs if it's on an industrial scale or more a higher level of production, shall we say.
So given that it's very sort of site specific and situation specific, what does natural farming look like for you on a practical level? How are you using it?
Well, for myself, it's a matter of understanding how crops and the ecosystem both survive and thrive so that we can create that more balanced and diverse soil life. What I would do is I would be looking to change the biology of my soil, which is mostly grass. So what I would look to do is to complement the agroforestry system that I am developing here specifically at the farm by recreating that soil life that is more suited to growing trees than it is suited to growing grass, shall we say. So the microbes that are able to support grass are not as supportive or not as robust, not as diverse as that within a forest. So essentially, I'm looking to take that life that exists in an old growth forest, collect that culture, collect that diverse range of microbes, multiply them out, and then apply them to my soil. So therefore, I change the soil biology from highly bacterial to highly fungal. So essentially what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to recreate a forest floor at the cheapest rate that I can do in order to support the introduction of an agroforestry system.
What would come first? Because I'm guessing if you take anything that's suited to living in a forest and then you put it onto a grassland environment, I'm guessing it would die out relatively quickly if it didn't have the correct infrastructure to support its life. So which do you get going first? The environment or the bacteria and the microbiome?
The easiest way that I try to describe it is that if I was to say to you who feeds the forest, you would answer that it would be the microbial life, it would be the quality of life that exists in that soil. That's what I'm looking to take, is that strength, that ability to be able to handle all conditions. It's proven by the tall trees that I'm looking at, by the strength of the ecosystem. I would take that life, and bear in mind that there's billions of microbes living in a teaspoon of soil. So I don't need to take that much of that life, because then I'm going to replicate that life by taking it through a process whereby I would increase that number exponentially. I would then introduce it to my own soil microbes. They in turn would teach my soil, if you like, how to do things, because that generation of soil has existed for eons. and they have the ability to be able to, for example, get through a drought such as we've had in recent times. So if I look at the forest area compared to the grassland areas, the forest were able to handle that, whereas the soil and the microbes that exist within a principally grassed area wouldn't be able to handle that drought.
There are loads of different ways of doing this according to your kind of work. And I don't know if I completely understand a lot of it. And I have read books. So for me, there's a little bit of demystification, I think, that I personally need. So I was thinking maybe to make it slightly easier for people to digest, is there one preparation that a home gardener could start with that you could recommend that's a kind of easy route in?
There's several that can be done very quickly. The cheapest and the most useful for somebody who's looking to understand how to take microbes from one environment and introduce it to another and directly see that benefit would be a microbial solution. Most people know that they can make a compost tea, and that's a matter of introducing worm castings into water, potentially bubbling that up, and that bubbling will increase the life, if you like. You're going to create a little orgy in a bucket, and that compost tea can then be put onto your soil. Everyone understands, if they've grown, how to make a compost tea. I would have thought, if that's the case, then the simplest way within Korean natural farming methods to do the same thing but achieve a better result, if I'm honest, is by taking the indigenous microorganisms that exist within an old growth forest. And by that I mean going into a national forest or into somewhere that hasn't been developed and looking under the leaf mold of the tallest tree or the most healthy trees that you can see. Within that leaf mold, underneath there, you will see the white hyphae. What you're going to do is grab a handful of that soil. You're going to take that and you're going to boil a potato. You're going to take both of those ingredients and you're going to put them into a sock or a little pair of tights, something like that. And you're going to introduce the boiled potato and the soil from the forest, and you're going to mix that into the water. It will be rainwater. It has to be the best quality water, would be soft water. And then what I would do is I would leave that in somewhere warm, put the lid on. You don't need to introduce any extra energy in bubbling that out. And what you'll see is that the life in that soil is so prolific that because you've introduced a very basic starch food, that life will multiply, and in that process you will see those bubbles appear on the surface of that water, and that shows me that that life has proliferated. And I will take that mixture after 2 to 3 days, depending on the temperature. I would then take that and immediately apply that onto my soil as I would do a compost or a compost tea. Or I would take that microbial solution and I would dilute that and apply it to my crops. So for me, I've seen and I've used the microbial solution, which is the same as a compost tea, same respect that you're introducing a food source to a bag of life and you're increasing that life exponentially. But the life that I've introduced is not a juvenile microbe. It's a broad spectrum of microbes that existed for eons. So they're more powerful microbes as such. And that's what I would say is the cheapest, easiest way in which you could proliferate and feed and regenerate soil using indigenous microorganisms.
What would you expect to see in terms of results with plant growth?
From experience, I've seen the eradication of potato blight as an example. That's a direct, immediate benefit that you're going to see. For trees, if you have trees that haven't fruited for a number of years, you're going to see change in that. You're going to see that improvement in the fruiting trees, and you're going to see mushrooms up in your soil. So we're introducing a highly fungal concentrate of life, which we've multiplied out. And as you would see mushrooms popping up in forests all the time, you're going to see that introduced into your crop area.
Just on the mushroom point, that's a good thing. Why?
The benefits of mushrooms is the fact that you're talking about mycorrhizal fungi. What you're talking about there is, to give you an example of where the most benefits come from, when you look at introducing an agroforestry system, the system is built upon the premise that you're going to be building the layers within that food forest, if you like. And to do that, you need to have access to all the micronutrients, all the minerals, all the requirements that are needed for long-term growth. That's not something that you can apply on there personally without great expense. Within agroforestry, that system develops and develops over time. But what I've found is by going directly to the old growth forest, introducing that microbial solution into the soil, then you're going to see that benefit, because that mycorrhizal fungi is effectively creating the internet under the ground for the exchange of nutrients to occur. So if there's a limit in boron in that particular space where you've planted trees that require boron, then the mycorrhizal fungi will, in exchange for simple sugars and within the exchange that exists within the soil food web, that nutrient, that hormone, whatever it is required, can be transported via the mycorrhizal fungi. So essentially, it's think of it as the internet under the ground. You can get anything off the internet, and that's essentially what trees and crops are going to be able to do in a highly fungal growing area.
It's fascinating stuff, and it does seem to make sense. The other question that I had is it as relevant for ornamental crops as it is for edibles?
Absolutely. Within the system, there are two levels, if you like. If you're a purist and you're somebody who has ornamental roses, for example, the ability to be able to grow the high value crops using the Korean natural farming systems will mean that you will eradicate many of the common problems that exist because of either monoculture or through breeding or just through general poor soil. So the Korean natural farming system does include, at the more agricultural level, if you like, so if you're doing this on a large scale, part of that system does include a recipe, a solution, if you like, for the eradication of blights and fungicides, and that's utilizing sulfur. Within ornamental gardening, sulfur is used, but in a form which is highly inefficient. Within the Korean natural farming system, we actually dissolve that sulfur so that we can apply that, and that applied directly eradicates the common problems that you get with ornamentals, such as
Black spot on roses is my favourite.
black spot. There you go. There's a perfect example of something that can be eradicated using one of the solutions within Korean natural farming, and that's the red clay sulfur that will be used in that situation. On that point, I work with many hemp farms around the UK, specifically because that problem was very much becoming a problem for many. And like I say, within Korean natural farming, that is resolved using the red clay sulfur. So it's very similar to the problems they have in the growing of the rice because of the damp environments.
If people want to find out more and maybe see it in action or get some recipes, obviously your website is very useful. Can you point people towards that and any other resources that you think might be useful?
Yes, certainly. I mean, I learned initially from the internet, if you like, and then I did train directly under somebody who was able to explain it to such a simplistic level that's what I've tried to replicate within the book that I've created. It's an ebook, but essentially it's trying to demystify and trying to explain that what you're looking to do is essentially mimic what the forest does. And within the growing of plants, essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to recreate a diverse soil biology, which means that the microbial life is foremost. So with plenty of life in the soil, you're then able to have healthy plants. Therefore, the interjection into those plants is very limited. My website does have a link to the book, but it's fair to say there's plenty of information out there which is freely available, because many people are adopting individual recipes, if you like. So where we've talked about microbial solution, very popular or becoming more popular is the lactic acid bacteria solution or recipe, because that's something that can be done very quickly in your own home. But once you understand the processes that go into making the LAB, you're essentially seeing a visual representation of what you're trying to do in every other one of the recipes within the system.
As you said about the forest, I was thinking actually sometimes forests aren't the most diverse in terms of species that they contain. Quite often they're a kind of monoculture of one particular tree, or you might get them where they're a bit impoverished because they're overgrazed by deer, and you just get kind of brambles and a few other floor plants, and then you'll get the trees, and you won't get a lot in between. So part of me thinks, is it right to hold those up as perfect ecosystems with all this diversity and life? And the other part maybe thinks, perhaps I'm just going to the wrong forests and woodlands. Do you need to seek out a healthy woodland in order to get your source material?
That's absolutely the case. And it's also demonstrated in what most growers will do to go and seek nutrition and microbial life. They will go to the local supplier of compost, and the understanding is that that compost is a material that will feed their plants. The trouble with that is that it's very immature compost. What we're looking to do within the Korean natural farming is specifically target the indigenous microorganisms that have existed for generations. And by generations, I mean they multiply by generation every 30 minutes. So if I was to go to my local supplier of compost, I may well get enough to be able to grow my turnips or leeks for a crop, but it's pretty much exhausted after that. Whereas if I go to an area of undisturbed, shall we say, a national park. So for me, I'm close to Dartmoor. So for me to be able to go to Dartmoor and find areas that are undeveloped, have a level of diversity, but have microbes that are able to support that life in a plant without any human interaction whatsoever, without any turning, without anything other than the natural processes. So what you're looking for is you're looking for areas that have been undisturbed. So you can go to a planted forest, but like you say, you're going to a monoculture. I would rather think of it as what you're introducing into your soil is rather like immigration into a country. So if we look at the rich nature and the diverse nature of the UK, it's only benefited by immigration through cultures, through music, through art, through food, through family, through genetics. Everything has improved from that diversity. And that's what you're looking to do within your soil, is be able to introduce a microbe that says, oh, I know how to grab moisture out of the air, not a problem. That's fine. We can get through this drought. Okay. That level of diversity is not achieved within compost from a commercial scale, but is self-evident in an old growth forest.
A really big thank you to David for taking part in the interview. David runs courses on his farm and he's really generous with his knowledge, so do please check out the link to his sites in the show notes and drop him a line if you'd like more information. Thank you to you two for listening, and to Jenny Loudon for suggesting David as a guest. Jenny has just launched a new gardening podcast called Somewhere to Grow, so go and check that out if you can, as she's just released her first episode. And very much on topic is Dr. Ian Bedford. here now to tell us about the creatures that live in our compost bins.
A recent poll of Britain's home gardeners found that only about a third of us were regularly composting our garden and kitchen food waste, even though it's a very easy way of producing an organic alternative to shop-bought composts. And besides, it creates a product from known ingredients. Compost is the material that results from the rotting of organic matter, and it's a natural process that occurs within the countryside and to a certain extent within any garden where dead organic matter has fallen, not just within a purpose-made bin. And this natural decomposition process is performed by a diverse community of living organisms, all of which have a part to play in systematically dismantling dead organic matter and releasing the nutrients that were stored within it. However, these organisms, that we call the composters and recyclers, are often overlooked within a home garden, and some are even mistakenly assumed to be plant pests. Which is quite ironic, really, since, being nature's waste disposal experts, they're arguably the most important organisms we need in our gardens if we're to have a naturally balanced system. Since without effectively recycling nutrients back into the soil, the health of our plants would consequently decline, as would the creatures that depend on the plants for their survival, and ultimately the creatures that depend on them. But occupying the darkest and dankest habitats, the composting community is quite remarkable in the way that so many different organisms work together to underpin and sustain the natural world. Organisms of very different sizes, shapes, and biological characteristics. From minuscule soil-dwelling microbes to the many species of invertebrates that live, feed, and breed amongst the detritus, such as the slugs that don't eat plants but consume decaying matter instead, the woodlice that macerate dead wood, the worms that pull fallen leaves underground to eat, and the immeasurable numbers of fly maggots that writhe and wriggle as they feed amongst the dead, all undertaking their specific roles on a production line where structured, multicellular matter is gradually, yet very effectively, broken down into its component parts to be used by the plants again. So maybe the next time those of us who use a compost bin add food waste and garden clippings, we'll spend a few minutes watching the composters and recyclers at work and realise that they're just as important to plants as the pollinators, and perhaps even more so within our home garden environment.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.